The Louisiana heat pressed down on Belmont Plantation like a suffocating shroud, thick with humidity and the stench of decay that seemed to seep from the very soil. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees like funeral veils, swaying in the oppressive stillness of the August evening. The Mississippi River churned lazily in the distance, its muddy waters carrying secrets that would never surface. In the cramped quarters of the slave cabins, whispers traveled faster than the evening breeze. They spoke of Madeline, the woman whose scarred face bore witness to unspeakable horrors, whose eyes held depths that seemed to peer beyond the veil of the living world. She sat alone on the rotting porch of her cabin, her weathered hands folded in her lap, lips moving in silent conversation with invisible companions. "She'd done it again," whispered Sarah, clutching her infant closer to her chest as she peered through the gaps in her cabin wall. "I heard her say old Moses' name 3 nights running. Found him this morning, cold as winter stone." The other slaves huddled together, their voices barely audible above the symphony of crickets and bullfrogs. Moses had been the oldest among them, a man who had survived 40 years of bondage through sheer will and stubborn defiance. Yet death had claimed him in his sleep, his face twisted in an expression of pure terror that no peaceful passing should bear. Madeline's voice drifted across the quarters, low and melodic, speaking words in a language that predated the French and Spanish colonizers, predated even the native tribes that once called this cursed land home. Her scarred lips formed syllables that seemed to make the very air tremble, and those who heard them felt ice in their veins despite the sweltering heat. "Lord have mercy," breathed Thomas, a field hand whose back bore the permanent marks of countless lashings. She speaking to them again? The dead ones, the scars that crisscrossed Madeline's dark skin, told stories of unimaginable suffering, some from the whip, others from rituals that the other slaves dared not contemplate. Her left eye was milky white, blinded by a brand that had been meant to mark her as property, but had instead opened something far more dangerous. When she turned that ruined gaze upon someone, they felt as though she could see straight through to their soul, could read the exact moment of their death, written in the lines of their fate. From the grand mansion that loomed over the plantation like a white sepulchre, Master Edmund Belmont watched the slave quarters through his study window. The crystal tumbler in his hand trembled slightly as he observed Madeline's solitary vigil. 3 deaths in as many weeks, all preceded by her nocturnal pronouncements. His overseer, a brutal man named Jeremiah Kane, had suggested selling her to the sugar plantations downriver, where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. But Belmont was a man caught between pragmatism and superstition. Madeline was his most productive worker during the day, her hands moving with supernatural efficiency through the cotton fields. Yet when darkness fell, she became something else entirely, a conduit for forces that his Presbyterian upbringing told him were either divine or demonic, with no middle ground between salvation and damnation. The mansion itself seemed to pulse with unease. Belmont's wife, Catherine, had taken to her bed with mysterious ailments that no doctor could diagnose. Their young son, Charles, spoke of nightmares filled with dark-skinned angels who whispered secrets in his ear. Even the house slaves moved through their duties with downcast eyes and trembling hands, as though they expected death to tap them on the shoulder at any moment. As midnight approached, Madeline rose from her porch and walked to the center of the quarters. The other slaves retreated into their cabins, but none could resist peering through cracks and gaps to witness what would unfold. She stood beneath the hanging tree, a massive oak where countless souls had met their end at the rope's embrace, and raised her face to the star-filled sky. Her voice rose in a chant that seemed to make the very earth beneath her feet vibrate with ancient power. The words were neither English nor French, neither Spanish nor any African dialect the slaves recognized. They were older, primal, carrying the weight of centuries and the authority of forces that existed before the first human drew breath. "Jeremiah Kane," she spoke suddenly, her voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. "Jeremiah Kane, your time draws near." The overseer's cabin, positioned strategically between the slave quarters and the main house, remained dark and silent. But those with keen ears could hear the sound of a man's labored breathing, the creak of floorboards as someone paced in agitation. Kane had heard his name spoken by the woman he had brutalized countless times, the woman whose scars bore his signature in flesh and blood. Madeline's prophecy hung in the air like a death sentence, and every soul on Belmont Plantation knew that when she spoke a name 3 times, the grave would soon claim another victim. The question that haunted them all was not whether Jeremiah Kane would die, but what dark forces would claim him, and who would be next to hear their name whispered by the woman who spoke with the dead. As the night deepened, and the plantation settled into an uneasy silence, Madeline returned to her cabin. But sleep would not come easily to anyone at Belmont that night, for they all knew that death had been invited to walk among them once again. Dawn broke over Belmont Plantation with the color of dried blood, painting the sky in ominous shades of crimson and amber. The morning mist rose from the Mississippi like the breath of restless spirits, and even the birds seemed reluctant to sing their usual chorus. In the overseer's cabin, Jeremiah Kane sat hunched over a bottle of whiskey, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the window that faced the slave quarters. He had not slept since hearing his name spoken by Madeline's cursed lips. Every shadow seemed to move with malevolent intent. Every creak of the wooden cabin sounded like footsteps approaching his door. The scars on his knuckles, earned from years of brutal discipline, ached with a phantom pain that no amount of alcohol could numb. Kane was a man who had built his reputation on fear and violence. Standing 6 feet tall with arms like tree trunks and a face that bore the permanent sneer of cruelty, he had broken more spirits than he could count. The slaves called him Devil Kane behind his back, and he wore the title like a badge of honor. But now, for the first time in his 43 years, Jeremiah Kane knew what it felt like to be afraid. The morning bell rang across the plantation, calling the slaves to their daily labor. Through his window, Kane watched as they emerged from their cabins like ghosts materializing in the mist. Their movements were subdued, their eyes downcast, but he could feel their collective gaze upon his cabin. They were waiting to see if Madeline's prophecy would come to pass. Madeline herself appeared last, stepping from her cabin with the fluid grace of a predator. Her scarred face was serene, almost peaceful, as though she had spent the night in communion with benevolent spirits rather than harbingers of death. She moved through the gathering slaves like a queen among her subjects, and Kane noticed how they parted before her with a mixture of reverence and terror. Master Belmont emerged from the main house, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from a sleepless night. His wife's condition had worsened during the dark hours. She had awakened screaming about shadows with burning eyes, claiming that something was trying to pull her soul from her body. The family physician, Dr. Rousseau, had administered laudanum, but even in her drugged stupor, Catherine Belmont continued to whisper about the woman who knows when death comes calling. Kane! Belmont's voice cracked like a whip across the morning air. Get these people to work. We've lost enough time to this nonsense. But even as he spoke the words, Belmont's eyes sought out Madeline among the assembled slaves. She stood perfectly still, her ruined eye fixed upon some distant point that only she could see. Her lips moved in silent conversation, and those close enough to observe noticed that her scarred hands trembled slightly, as though she were struggling to contain some tremendous force within her frail frame. Kane forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady from the night's drinking. He grabbed his whip, a braided leather instrument that had tasted the blood of countless victims, and stepped out into the humid morning air. The slaves watched his approach with expressions that ranged from hatred to pity, but none showed the fear that had once been his most reliable tool of control. "You heard the master," Kane growled, his voice hoarse from whiskey and sleepless hours. Get to the fields, and you—" He pointed the handle of his whip at Madeline. "Keep your mouth shut about your devil's prophecies. I won't have you spreading panic among the others." Madeline turned her gaze upon him, and Cain felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Her good eye held depths of knowledge that seemed to encompass centuries of suffering and wisdom, while her blind eye reflected the morning light like a pearl pulled from the depths of hell. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "3 times I have spoken your name, Jeremiah Cain. 3 times the spirits have whispered of your coming journey. Before the sun sets on this day, you will understand the price of the pain you have sown." The other slaves began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising like the buzz of angry wasps. Cain raised his whip, but his hand shook so violently that the leather strips trembled like leaves in a storm. He had beaten Madeline countless times before, had carved some of those very scars into her flesh with his own hands, but now he found himself paralyzed by a terror that defied rational explanation. "Enough!" Master Bellamont strode forward, his face flushed with anger and fear. "Madeline, you will report to the house immediately. Mrs. Belmont wishes to speak with you." A collective gasp rose from the assembled slaves. Never before had one of their number been summoned to the main house for anything other than punishment or service. The implications were staggering. Either Madeline was about to face a fate worse than death, or the White family was seeking her counsel in matters that transcended the normal boundaries between master and slave. As Madeline walked toward the mansion, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth, Cain felt a strange sensation wash over him. The morning sun seemed to dim, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight that made breathing difficult. His chest tightened, and for a moment he could have sworn he heard voices whispering his name from every direction, voices of the dead, calling him to join their eternal congregation. The slaves dispersed to their daily labors, but their movements were mechanical, distracted. They kept glancing toward the main house, where Madeline had disappeared through the servants' entrance like a dark angel entering the gates of heaven. In the fields, the cotton plants seemed to wither beneath their touch, and more than one worker reported seeing shadows moving between the rows where no shadows should exist. As the day progressed, Cain found himself unable to concentrate on his duties. Every sound made him jump. Every movement in his peripheral vision caused his heart to race. The whiskey that had been his constant companion for years now tasted like ash in his mouth, and the whip that had been his instrument of power felt heavy and foreign in his grip. By midday, when the sun hung like a malevolent eye in the cloudless sky, Jeremiah Cain began to understand that some prophecies were not warnings to be heeded, but sentences to be served. And somewhere in the depths of the Belmont mansion, Madeline sat in conference with forces that would soon reshape the very foundations of the plantation's cursed existence. The interior of Belmont Mansion was a study in faded grandeur, its once pristine walls now bearing the stains of Louisiana's relentless humidity and something far more insidious, the weight of accumulated sins. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears from ornate ceilings, their light casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and decay, a sickly sweet perfume that masked the underlying rot of a house built on human suffering. Catherine Bellamont lay propped against silk pillows in the master bedroom, her once beautiful face now gaunt and pale as parchment. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her blonde hair hung in limp strands around her shoulders. She had been the belle of New Orleans society before her marriage to Edmund, a woman whose beauty and charm had opened doors throughout the South. Now, at 32, she looked like a spectre haunting her own life. When Madeline entered the room, escorted by a trembling house slave named Celia, Catherine's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She had heard the whispers, the stories of the scarred woman who spoke with the dead. In her current state of terror and confusion, Madeline represented either salvation or damnation, and Catherine was no longer certain there was a difference between the two. "Leave us," Catherine whispered to Celia, who fled the room as though pursued by demons. Madeline stood perfectly still in the doorway, her ruined eye reflecting the lamplight like a beacon from another world. She wore the simple homespun dress of a field slave, but her bearing was that of a queen surveying her domain. The scars that crisscrossed her dark skin seemed to pulse with their own inner light, each mark a testament to suffering that had been transformed into something far more powerful than mere endurance. "You sent for me, mistress," Madeline said, her voice carrying no trace of subservience despite the formal address. Catherine struggled to sit up straighter, her hands clutching the bedsheets like anchors in a storm. They say you can see things, know things, about death, about what comes after." "Death speaks to those who have walked close enough to its threshold," Madeline replied. "I have died many times in this life, mistress. Each scar, each brand, each breaking of my spirit was a small death. And in those moments of dying, I learned to hear voices that others cannot." The confession that spilled from Catherine's lips came in broken whispers, punctuated by sobs that seemed to tear at her very soul. She spoke of the nightmares that had plagued her for months, visions of dark figures standing at the foot of her bed, their eyes burning with accusation and rage. She described the voices that whispered her name in the darkness, speaking of debts that must be paid and sins that demanded retribution. But it was her final revelation that caused even Madeline's scarred features to shift with something approaching surprise. Catherine reached beneath her pillow with trembling fingers and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and stained with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. "This belonged to my husband's father," Catherine whispered. "Old Master Bellamont. I found it hidden in the walls when we renovated the library. The things written in here, the things this family has done." Madeline approached the bed with measured steps, her good eye fixed on the journal as though it were a venomous serpent. When Catherine held it out to her, she hesitated for a moment before taking it in her scarred hands. The leather felt warm to the touch, almost alive, and she could sense the weight of the secrets contained within its pages. The journal chronicled 3 generations of Belmont family history, but it was not the sanitized version that appeared in official records. Instead, it detailed a legacy of cruelty that went far beyond the normal brutalities of plantation life. Old Master Bellamont had been a man obsessed with power, not just over his slaves' bodies, but over their very souls. The pages described rituals conducted in the depths of the Louisiana swamps, ceremonies that blended African spiritual practices with European occultism in ways that violated the natural order. Slaves had been sacrificed not just to maintain discipline, but to feed something hungry and ancient that dwelt in the shadows between worlds. The hanging tree in the slave quarters had been planted specifically for these purposes, its roots nourished by blood and watered with tears. "He made pacts," Catherine continued, her voice barely audible, "agreements with things that should never be bargained with. In exchange for prosperity, for power over life and death, he promised them souls, generations of souls." Madeline's fingers traced the faded ink, and she could feel the malevolent energy that radiated from every word. The journal spoke of a debt that passed from father to son, a spiritual mortgage that could only be paid with the suffering of the innocent. Edmund Bellamont had inherited more than just land and slaves. He had inherited a covenant with darkness that demanded constant feeding. "The nightmares started after Charles was born," Catherine whispered. "They want him, don't they? They want my son to continue what his grandfather began." Before Madeline could respond, a commotion erupted from somewhere in the house below. Shouts echoed through the halls, followed by the sound of running footsteps and slamming doors. Through the bedroom window, they could see slaves gathering in the yard, Their faces turned toward the overseer's cabin, where smoke was beginning to rise from the windows. Madeline closed the journal and fixed Catherine with her penetrating gaze. "The debt your family owes cannot be paid with money or land, mistress. It can only be settled with truth, with justice, with the breaking of chains that bind both the living and the dead." As the smoke outside grew thicker and the shouts grew louder, Catherine Belmont realized that her family's reckoning had finally arrived. The woman who spoke with the dead had come not as a servant, but as an instrument of divine retribution. And somewhere in the growing chaos below, Jeremiah Kane was about to discover that some prophecies were not warnings, but promises that would be kept regardless of the cost. The journal in Madeline's hands seemed to pulse with malevolent life, its pages containing secrets that would either damn the Belmont family forever or offer them a chance at redemption through the very suffering they had inflicted upon others. The choice, Madeline knew, was no longer theirs to make. The smoke that rose from Jeremiah Kane's cabin was not the clean smoke of burning wood, but something far more sinister. Thick, black tendrils that seemed to writhe with malevolent purpose as they clawed their way toward the cloudless sky. The acrid smell carried on the humid air was not just that of burning timber and cloth, but something organic and foul, as though the very essence of corruption had been set ablaze. From the master bedroom window, Catherine and Madeline watched as slaves gathered in a wide circle around the overseer's quarters, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of flames that seemed to burn with unnatural intensity. None of them moved to fight the fire or call for help. They simply stood in silent witness to what they all understood to be a divine judgment finally rendered. Jeremiah Kane emerged from his burning cabin like a man possessed, his clothes singed and his face blackened with soot, but it was his eyes that told the true story of his terror. Wide and wild, darting frantically in all directions as though he were being pursued by invisible demons. He stumbled and fell, picked himself up, and ran toward the main house with the desperate gait of a man fleeing for his very soul. "Help me!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Something's in there! Something's trying to take me!" But even as he ran, the slaves could see that he was not alone. Shadows moved around him, not the natural shadows cast by the morning sun, but dark shapes that seemed to have substance and purpose. They reached for him with fingers like smoke, grasping at his clothes and hair, leaving marks on his skin that looked suspiciously like burns. Master Edmund Belmont burst from the main house, his face flushed with anger and confusion. He had been in his study, trying to make sense of the plantation's deteriorating situation, when the commotion began. Now, seeing his overseer in such a state, he felt the last vestiges of his rational world crumbling around him. "What in God's name is happening here?" Belmont demanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. The events of recent weeks had shaken his confidence, and the sight of Kane's terror-stricken face filled him with a dread he could not name. Kane fell to his knees before his master, clutching at Belmont's legs like a drowning man grasping for driftwood. "She did this, that devil woman. She called them up from hell itself." As if summoned by his words, Madeline appeared on the mansion's front porch, the leather journal still clutched in her scarred hands. She descended the steps with the measured pace of a judge approaching the bench, her ruined eye fixed on the cowering overseer with an expression of terrible certainty. "Jeremiah Kane," she spoke, and her voice seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. "The spirits of those you have murdered cry out for justice. The children you have beaten to death, the women you have violated and killed, the men you have broken in body and spirit, they all stand here now, waiting to escort you to your final judgment." The slaves began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising in a low chant that seemed to harmonize with some unheard melody. They spoke names, dozens of names, of those who had died under Kane's brutal reign. Each name seemed to add weight to the air, making it harder to breathe, harder to think clearly. Kane's eyes rolled back in his head, and foam appeared at the corners of his mouth. His body began to convulse, and when he spoke, it was not with his own voice, but with the voices of his victims, men, women, and children speaking in unison through his trembling lips. "We have waited so long," the voices said, "waited in the darkness between worlds for justice to be served. Now, the time has come for the debt to be paid." Belmont backed away from his overseer, his face pale with horror. He had always prided himself on being a rational man, a product of Enlightenment thinking who put little stock in superstition or folklore. But the evidence before his eyes could not be denied or explained away by logic or reason. The fire in Kane's cabin had spread to the nearby storage buildings, but the flames moved in patterns that defied natural law. They formed shapes, human figures dancing in the inferno, their arms raised in celebration or supplication. The smoke continued to rise in spirals that looked almost like writing, spelling out words in a language that predated human civilization. Dr. Rousseau arrived on horseback, his medical bag bouncing against his side as he dismounted and hurried toward the scene. He was a man of science, trained in the latest medical techniques at universities in Paris and Philadelphia. But when he saw Kane's condition, the way his body contorted, the multiple voices speaking through his mouth, the burns that appeared on his skin without any contact with flame, even his rational mind began to crack under the weight of the impossible. "This is not a medical condition," Rousseau whispered to Belmont. "This is something else entirely. Something beyond the reach of earthly medicine." Madeline approached the convulsing overseer, and as she drew near, his thrashing became more violent. The voices speaking through him grew louder, more insistent, demanding retribution for decades of unpunished crimes. She knelt beside him, placing one scarred hand on his forehead, and suddenly the chaos around them fell into perfect silence. "You have lived by violence and cruelty," she said, her voice gentle despite the terrible words she spoke. "You have taken pleasure in the pain of others, have fed your soul on suffering and despair. Now you will know what it feels like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of forces beyond your control." Kane's body went rigid, his back arching impossibly, as though invisible hands were lifting him from the ground. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and from his throat emerged not sound, but something else, a dark mist that seemed to carry with it the essence of every evil act he had ever committed. The mist rose into the air and dispersed, carried away by winds that touched nothing else. When it was gone, Jeremiah Kane collapsed to the ground, his body empty and still. Dr. Rousseau rushed to check for signs of life, but they all knew what he would find, or rather, what he would not find. "He's dead," Rousseau announced, his voice barely audible. "But I've never seen anything like this. His body shows no signs of injury, no indication of what might have caused his death. It's as though his soul simply left." As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the plantation grounds, the assembled slaves began to disperse. They moved with a sense of completion, as though a long-awaited chapter had finally been closed. The fire in the overseer's cabin burned itself out, leaving behind only a pile of ash that the wind would soon scatter to the four corners of the earth. But even as justice had been served upon Jeremiah Kane, Madeline knew that his death was only the beginning. The journal in her hands contained secrets that went far deeper than one man's cruelty, and the forces that had been awakened would not be satisfied with a single soul. The Belmont family's reckoning was far from over, and the dead who walked among them had many more debts to collect before their hunger for justice would be satisfied. The death of Jeremiah Kane cast a pall over Belmont Plantation that seemed to seep into the very foundations of the earth. His body was removed by Dr. Rousseau and two field hands, but the memory of his final moments lingered like a stain that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The slaves went about their daily tasks with a mixture of relief and apprehension, relief that their tormentor was gone, but apprehension about what his supernatural demise might herald for the future. Master Edmund Belmont retreated to his study, where he sat surrounded by ledgers and legal documents that suddenly seemed as meaningless as children's scribblings. The rational world he had constructed around himself was crumbling, and in its place rose something far more ancient and terrible. He poured himself a generous measure of bourbon, but the alcohol did nothing to calm the trembling in his hands or the ice-cold fear that had settled in his chest. The leather journal that Madeline had taken from his wife's room lay open on his desk, its pages revealing secrets that his father had taken to the grave, or so Edmund had believed. Now, reading the meticulous records of rituals and sacrifices, of pacts made with entities that existed beyond the veil of human understanding, he began to comprehend the true nature of his inheritance. His father, Matthias Bellamont, had been a man of seemingly infinite ambition and equally infinite cruelty. The journal detailed how he had sought power not just over his fellow men, but over the forces of life and death themselves. In the deepest swamps of Louisiana, where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds and the water ran black with centuries of decay, Matthias had conducted ceremonies that violated every law of God and nature. The entries spoke of an entity known only as the Harvester, a being that fed on human suffering and despair, growing stronger with each soul offered to its insatiable hunger. In exchange for prosperity and dominion over life and death, Matthias had promised this creature a steady supply of victims, beginning with his own slaves and extending to anyone who dared oppose his will. But the most chilling revelation was yet to come. As Edmund read deeper into his father's confessions, he discovered that the pact was not limited to a single generation. It was a covenant that passed from father to son, binding each successive heir to continue the dark work or face consequences that would make death seem like a mercy. The debt must be paid, Matthias had written in his spidery handwriting. Each generation must feed the harvester, must provide it with the suffering it craves. Should the covenant be broken, should a Bellamont refuse to honor the agreement, then all who bear our name will face a reckoning that will echo through eternity. Edmund's hands shook as he turned the pages, reading accounts of rituals conducted beneath the hanging tree, of slaves who had been selected not for punishment but for sacrifice. The tree itself had been planted in soil mixed with human blood, its roots extending deep into the earth where they could draw sustenance from the bones of the murdered. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his reading. "Come in!" he called, his voice hoarse with fear and whiskey. To his surprise, it was not a servant who entered, but Madeline herself. She moved through the room with the same fluid grace she had displayed in the slave quarters, her scarred face serene despite the chaos that surrounded them. In her hands, she carried something that made Edmund's blood run cold, a small wooden box carved with symbols that matched those described in his father's journal. "You have been reading the truth of your family's legacy," she said, her voice carrying no trace of accusation, only statement of fact. Edmund nodded, unable to trust his voice. The box in Madeline's hand seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and he could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on his chest. "Your father was not the first to make such bargains," Madeline continued, settling into the chair across from his desk, as though she were an invited guest rather than a slave. "The harvester is old, older than the first ships that brought my people to these shores in chains. It has fed on suffering for centuries, growing fat on the pain of the innocent." She opened the box, revealing its contents to Edmund's horrified gaze. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a collection of objects that defied rational explanation. Bones that gleamed with an inner light, stones carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and at the center, a small vial filled with liquid that seemed to move with its own volition. "These are the tools your father used to bind his family to darkness," Madeline explained. "Each object carries a piece of the covenant, a fragment of the promise that has damned 3 generations of Bellamont men." Edmund leaned back in his chair, his face pale as parchment. "What do you want from me? Why are you showing me this?" Madeline's ruined eye fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel as though she were peering directly into his soul. "Because the time has come to choose, Master Bellamont. You can continue your father's work, can feed the harvester with the blood of the innocent and maintain your family's prosperity. Or you can break the covenant and face the consequences of 3 generations of accumulated debt. And if I choose to break it, what then? Then the harvester will come to collect what it is owed. Every soul that should have been sacrificed, every debt that has gone unpaid, will be demanded at once. Your family will face a reckoning that will consume not just you, but your wife and son as well." Edmund's thoughts turned to Catherine, lying pale and terrified in their bedroom, and to young Charles, whose innocent laughter had been replaced by whispered conversations with invisible friends. The weight of his father's sins pressed down on him like a physical force, and he understood that there were no good choices left, only degrees of damnation. "There is a third option," Madeline said softly, as though reading his thoughts, "one that your father never considered because his heart was too filled with greed and pride to see it." She reached into the box and withdrew the vial of moving liquid, holding it up to the lamplight where it seemed to writhe like a living thing. "The covenant can be transferred. The debt can be paid by one who chooses to bear it willingly, one whose suffering has already opened the doors between worlds." Edmund stared at her in horror and understanding. "You're offering to take it on yourself, to become the sacrifice that breaks the cycle." "I am offering to do what should have been done generations ago, to face the harvester not as a victim, but as an equal. My scars have made me strong, Master Bellamont. My pain has given me power that your father never possessed. I can meet this entity on its own terms and end its hold over your family forever." As thunder began to rumble in the distance and the first drops of rain spattered against the study windows, Edmund Bellamont realized that the woman sitting across from him was offering him something he had never dared hope for: redemption. But the price she was willing to pay made him question whether he deserved such a sacrifice, and whether accepting it would make him complicit in one final terrible act of exploitation. The choice before him would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of every soul on Bellamont Plantation. And somewhere in the gathering storm, the harvester waited with infinite patience for the debt that had been promised so long ago to finally be paid in full. The storm that approached Belmont Plantation was unlike any that had ever swept across the Louisiana Delta. The clouds gathered with unnatural speed, forming spirals and patterns that seemed to mock the laws of meteorology. Lightning flickered within their depths, not the clean white fire of natural electricity, but something darker, tinged with colors that had no names and cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. In the slave quarters, the inhabitants huddled together in their cabins, but not from fear of wind and rain. They could sense something far more dangerous approaching, a presence that made the air itself feel thick and oppressive, as though the very atmosphere were holding its breath in anticipation of some cosmic judgment. Sarah clutched her infant son closer to her chest, whispering prayers in a mixture of English and half-remembered African dialects. The other slaves joined their voices to hers, creating a low harmonic chant that seemed to provide some small protection against the malevolent forces gathering around them. They all understood that this was no ordinary storm, but rather the physical manifestation of spiritual warfare that had been building for generations. In the main house, Catherine Bellamont had risen from her sickbed, driven by a maternal instinct that transcended her physical weakness. She found her son, Charles, in the nursery, standing at the window with his small hands pressed against the glass, watching the approaching tempest with eyes that held far too much knowledge for a child of 7 years. "Mama," he said without turning around, "the dark angels are coming. They're angry about the promises that were broken." Catherine's heart clenched with terror as she realized that her son had inherited more than just the Belmont name. He had also inherited the spiritual sensitivity that made him a target for the forces his grandfather had awakened. She gathered him into her arms, feeling how thin and fragile he had become in recent weeks, as though something were slowly draining the life from his small body. "We're going to leave this place," she whispered into his hair. "Tonight, as soon as your father—" "No, Mama," Charles interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that no child should possess. "We can't run from this. The dark angels will follow us wherever we go. The only way to make them stop is to give them what they want." In the study below, Edmund Belmont sat across from Madeline, the cursed artifacts spread between them like the pieces of some infernal chess game. The vial of moving liquid seemed to pulse in rhythm with the approaching thunder, and the carved bones had begun to emit a low, humming sound that made his teeth ache. "Tell me exactly what this ritual involves," Edmund said, his voice barely steady. "If you're going to sacrifice yourself for my family's sins, I need to understand what you'll be facing." Madeline's scarred fingers traced the symbols carved into the wooden box, and as she touched each one, it flared briefly with eldritch light. "The harvester feeds on suffering, but it respects strength. Your father approached it as a supplicant, begging for power and offering the pain of others as payment. But I will meet it as an equal, one who has endured every torment it could devise and emerged stronger for the experience." She lifted the vial and held it up to the lamplight, where the liquid within seemed to form shapes, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching desperately toward some unseen salvation. "This contains the essence of every soul your family has sacrificed over 3 generations. They are trapped, unable to move on to whatever comes after death, forced to serve as fuel for the harvester's power. And you can free them. I can try. But the ritual must be performed at the source of the Covenant's power, beneath the hanging tree, where your grandfather first made his bargain with darkness. And it must be done during the storm, when the barriers between worlds are at their thinnest." As if summoned by her words, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the mansion to its foundations. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by the eerie glow emanating from the artifacts. In that moment, both Edmund and Madeline could feel the presence of something vast and hungry approaching, drawn by the scent of fear and the promise of long-delayed payment. "It's here," Madeline whispered, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "The harvester has come to collect what it believes it is owed." Through the study windows, they could see the slave quarters illuminated by flashes of unnatural lightning. But the slaves were no longer cowering in their cabins. They had emerged into the storm, forming a circle around the hanging tree with their arms linked and their voices raised in songs that predated Christianity, predated even the oldest African traditions. They were calling upon powers that existed before the first human drew breath, seeking protection from forces that their ancestors had faced in the primordial darkness of the world's youth. Edmund felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find his wife standing behind him, their son clutched in her arms. Catherine's face was pale but determined, and he could see that she had made her own decision about what must be done. "We're going with you," she said simply. "This is our family's debt, and we won't let another person pay it alone." "Catherine, no. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than living with this curse for the rest of our lives. More dangerous than watching our son slowly waste away as the harvester feeds on his life force." She shook her head firmly. "We created this situation, Edmund. We have to be part of the solution." Young Charles looked up at his father with eyes that seemed far older than his years. "The Dark Angels told me something, Papa. They said that the only way to break a covenant made in selfishness is to replace it with one made in love. Someone has to choose to sacrifice themselves, not for power or gain, but to protect others." As the storm reached its full fury and the very air around them began to crackle with supernatural energy, the Belmont family and the scarred slave woman who had become their unlikely salvation prepared to face the entity that had held them in bondage for 3 generations. The hanging tree awaited them, its ancient branches reaching toward the storm-torn sky like the arms of some primordial god demanding tribute. But this time, the sacrifice offered would not be one of helpless victims, but of willing souls choosing love over fear, redemption over damnation, and in that choice lay either their salvation or their final, irrevocable doom. The hanging tree stood like a monument to suffering in the center of the slave quarters, its massive trunk scarred by decades of rope burns and its branches twisted into shapes that seemed to reach toward heaven in supplication or toward hell in invitation. The storm raged around it with supernatural fury, but the ancient oak remained unmoved, as though it were the axis around which the very world turned. Madeline approached the tree with measured steps, the wooden box of artifacts clutched against her chest. Behind her walked the Belmont family, Edmund with his jaw set in grim determination, Catherine pale but resolute, and young Charles moving with the eerie calm of a child who had already seen too much of the darkness that lurked beyond the veil of ordinary existence. The slaves had formed a protective circle around the tree, their linked hands creating a barrier of human will and spiritual strength against the malevolent forces that pressed in from all sides. Their voices rose in harmonies that seemed to make the very air vibrate with power, calling upon ancestors and spirits to witness what was about to unfold. As they reached the base of the tree, the temperature dropped precipitously, and their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The storm above them intensified, but the rain that fell was not water. It was something darker, thicker, that hissed when it touched the ground and left stains that looked suspiciously like blood. "It comes," Madeline said, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. The harvester materialized slowly, coalescing from shadow and storm into a form that challenged the mind's ability to process what it was seeing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and contract according to no earthly geometry. Its face was a void filled with stars that burned with cold fire, and when it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The debt is due," the entity intoned, its words causing the very ground to tremble. "3 generations have fed me with the suffering of the innocent. Now the covenant must be fulfilled, or all who bear the Belmont name will know torment beyond imagining." Edmund stepped forward, his legs trembling, but his voice steady. "I am Edmund Belmont, heir to this cursed legacy. I offer myself in payment for my family's sins." The harvester's attention turned to him, and Edmund felt as though he were being examined by something that could see not just his body, but his soul laid bare in all its weakness and fear. "Your suffering would be sweet," the entity mused, "but it would not satisfy the debt. You have lived in comfort while others paid the price of your prosperity. Your pain would be brief, your spirit easily broken." It was then that Madeline stepped forward, opening the wooden box and revealing the artifacts within. As she did so, the scars that covered her body began to glow with an inner light, each mark telling the story of torment endured and survived. "I am Madeline," she said, her voice carrying a power that made even the harvester pause. "I have walked through every hell you could devise and emerged stronger. I have died 1,000 deaths and been reborn in fire and pain. I offer myself not as a victim, but as an equal." The entity's form shifted and writhed as it considered her words. "You interest me, scarred one. Your suffering has indeed been exquisite, your endurance remarkable. But what makes you think you can bargain with forces beyond your comprehension?" Madeline reached into the box and withdrew the vial of trapped souls, holding it up so that its contents caught the eldritch light of the storm. "Because I understand something that the Belmont men never did. You feed on suffering, yes, but what you truly crave is the moment when hope dies, when the spirit finally breaks. But I have been broken so many times that I have learned to rebuild myself stronger than before. She uncorked the vial, and immediately the air filled with the whispered voices of the dead. Dozens of souls, crying out for release from their eternal torment. The harvester leaned forward, its void face filled with hungry anticipation. "I offer you a new covenant," Madeline continued, "not one based on the exploitation of the innocent, but on a willing exchange. Take me, and in return, release these trapped souls and break the hold you have over the Belmont family. Let them live free of your influence, and I will serve as your willing vessel for as long as you desire." The entity circled her slowly, its impossible form casting shadows that moved independently of its body. "And what makes you think your single soul is worth more than the generations of suffering I have been promised?" Madeline smiled, and in that expression was a terrible beauty that made even the harvester hesitate. "Because my soul is not single. Every person I have helped, every kindness I have shown despite my own pain, every moment of hope I have given to others, they are all part of me now. You would not be taking one soul, but hundreds, all freely given in love rather than stolen in fear." The slaves around the tree began to chant louder, their voices joining with Madeline's in a harmony that seemed to make the very fabric of reality tremble. One by one, they stepped forward, placing their hands on her shoulders, offering their own strength to support her sacrifice. "We stand with her," Sarah called out, her infant son sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the supernatural chaos around them. "She has been our voice when we had none, our strength when we were weak. If she goes to face the darkness, she does not go alone." The harvester's form began to waver, as though the display of unity and love was somehow painful to its existence. "This is unexpected," it admitted. "I have fed on fear and despair for so long that I had forgotten the taste of willing sacrifice made in love." Catherine Belmont stepped forward, still holding young Charles in her arms. "Then taste it now," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "We offer ourselves as well, not as payment for our family's sins, but as partners in breaking the cycle of suffering that has poisoned this land for too long." The entity's attention turned to the child in her arms, and Charles looked up at it with eyes that held no fear, only a sad wisdom that belonged to someone far older. "You're hungry," the boy said simply, "but you're eating the wrong things. Pain and fear taste bitter, don't they? Love tastes much better." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the harvester stood perfectly still, its void face reflecting the stormlight in patterns that might have been confusion or might have been something approaching wonder. When it finally spoke, its voice had lost some of its terrible authority. "I remember," it said slowly. "Before the hunger, before the feeding on suffering, there was something else. Something that sustained me without requiring the pain of others." Madeline nodded, understanding flooding her scarred features. "You were not always a harvester of souls. You were something else once, something that fed on love and joy and hope. The corruption came later, when humans began to offer you suffering instead of celebration. The entity's form began to change, the shadows and void stuff that composed it shifting into something more recognizable, more human. "I had forgotten," it whispered. "The first offerings were not sacrifices, but gifts freely given in gratitude and love. When did I become this thing of hunger and darkness?" "When people stopped believing that love was stronger than fear," Madeline replied. "But it's not too late to remember what you once were." The storm above them began to calm, the unnatural lightning fading to ordinary flashes of electrical discharge. The harvester, or what it had once been, stood before them in a form that was almost human, its features shifting between shadow and light as it struggled to remember its original nature. "The covenant is broken," it said finally. "Not through payment of debt, but through the offering of something far more valuable, the choice to love despite suffering, to hope despite despair. The souls I have held captive are free to find their rest, and the Belmont family is released from the bonds that have held them for 3 generations. As the entity spoke these words, the vial in Madeline's hands shattered, releasing streams of light that rose into the storm-torn sky like shooting stars. Each point of light was a soul finally free to continue its journey, and their departure left behind a sense of peace that seemed to settle over the plantation like a benediction. The harvester, now transformed into something that might once have been called an angel, turned to Madeline one final time. "You offered to serve as my vessel, Scarred One. Do you still hold to that bargain?" Madeline considered the question carefully, her good eye fixed on the faces of the people around her, the slaves who had become her family, the white family who had learned to see beyond the color of her skin to the strength of her spirit. "I offer to serve as a bridge," she said finally, "between the world of the living and whatever realm you will return to. When people need to remember that love is stronger than fear, that hope can survive even the darkest suffering, I will be here to remind them." The entity nodded, and as it did so, it began to fade, becoming translucent and then transparent, until only a whisper of its presence remained. "Then let this place be a sanctuary," it said as it departed. "Let it be a reminder that even the darkest covenants can be broken by the simple choice to love one another." As dawn broke over Belmont Plantation, the storm clouds dispersed to reveal a sky washed clean and bright. The hanging tree still stood in the center of the slave quarters, but its twisted branches had somehow straightened during the night, and new leaves were already beginning to sprout from its bark. The scars that had marked it for so long remained, but they no longer spoke of suffering. Instead, they told the story of survival, of transformation, of hope reborn from the ashes of despair. Madeline stood beneath the tree, her own scars still visible, but somehow transformed as well. They no longer marked her as a victim, but as a survivor, a woman who had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple, revolutionary act of choosing love over hate. The slaves began to disperse to their daily tasks, but their movements were different now, lighter, freer, as though invisible chains had been broken during the night. The Belmont family stood together, truly together for the first time in years, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "What happens now?" Edmund asked, his voice hoarse from the night's ordeal. Madeline smiled, and in that expression was a peace that had been hard-won through decades of suffering and struggle. "Now we begin again," she said simply. "We build something new on the foundation of what we've learned. We choose to see each other not as master and slave, but as human beings deserving of dignity and respect." As the sun climbed higher in the Louisiana sky, casting its warm light over a plantation that had been transformed by the simple but revolutionary power of love conquering fear, the people of Belmont began the long work of healing. The dead had found their rest, the living had found their freedom, and the future stretched before them bright with possibility. The woman who had spoken the names of the dead had become something new, not a prophet of doom, but a herald of hope. And in the years that followed, when people spoke of Madeline, they would remember not the scars that marked her body, but the light that shone from her spirit, proving that even in the darkest places, love could take root and flourish. The profane prophecies had been fulfilled, but their ending was not one of damnation. It was one of redemption, purchased not with blood and suffering, but with the willing sacrifice of those who chose to love, even when love seemed impossible. And in that choice, they had found not just freedom for themselves, but a path forward for all who would follow in their footsteps.